hi everybody, Ezra Levant here, standing under a tree because it's starting to rain. I'm actually right near the Federal Court of Appeal. That's that really big building there, where we just had a 3-hour hearing. Rebel News taking on Mark Carney, or actually, it's more like Mark Carney taking on Rebel News. The subject matter is a journalism license that Justin Trudeau brought in several years ago. Rebel News applied for it. It's called the QCJO, Qualified Canadian Journalism Organization. It's basically a journalism license. You have to apply for the government. If you don't get it, they have the power to order social media platforms to downrank your discoverability. That's in Bill C-18. It allows the government to order Facebook, YouTube, Google, etc., to make it so when people search for your news source, the licensed QCJO choices are boosted and the independent citizen journalists are throttled. That's why it's so dangerous. Anyways, I won't go into the QCJO right now. I want to talk about the hearing we just had. Rebel News had 2 lawyers. Government of Canada had 2 lawyers sitting at the front, but it ranged over the period of time up to 3 others in the back of the court on their side. On my side, it was just me. It was a huge courtroom, completely empty, other than the lawyers, 2 clerks, 3 judges. It was a 3-judge panel, and me. There was no civil liberties people there from all the traditional groups who claim to be for press freedom. There was no one there from the Canadian Association of Journalists. There was no one there from Canadian Journalists for Free Expression. No one there from Amnesty International, PEN Canada. Of course not, because they've all been co-opted. They've all taken the QCJO news license and the subsidy that comes with it. Rebel News doesn't want the subsidy. We just want the ability to do our jobs. But you see what that's done? That's neutered, that's nullified any independent spirit in the media. And it hasn't happened overnight. It's been a 10-year process. I think if you could go back in time 10 years and tell the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the CBC, what has become of this journalism license, they would be shocked. But over the course of 10 years, they become more and more dependent on government cash and more obedient. It's just a handful of outliers like Rebel News. Anyway, so to the court, it was astonishing to hear some of the arguments from the government. One of the government lawyers said this is not journalism regulation or policing at all. It is not journalism regulation, she said. Well, of course it is. That's why we're here. We wouldn't care if it wasn't journalism regulation. There are literally regulations that are published. It just was very bizarre. What I learned today that maybe I didn't quite register is that there was a professional civil servant at the Canada Revenue Agency who approved our QCJO status. I actually don't think I knew that, but Trudeau's hand-picked committee of his journalist friends who are not staffers at the CRA, Trudeau just appointed a committee. I mean, he named his allies to it. They contradicted the CRA civil servant and made her change her report. Can you believe that? A government civil servant said, yeah, Rebel News passes the test, and then Trudeau's friend says, no, it doesn't. So then the lady in civil servant says, oh, sorry, I'll ban them. The craziest thing is the reason why. In their first attempt at banning us, they said we were too opinionated. They actually said that, but they realized that that was not a grounds under law to ban us, because opinion journalism is acceptable journalism. It's half of what the CBC and the Toronto Star does anyways. But they later said that what we did was not real news. They said that only 2% of what we do is real news. And I thought, how can they even say that? That doesn't make any sense. We don't do weather, we don't do sports, we don't do human interest stories. How could you possibly say? And we selected the audit period in question 3 weeks during the trucker convoy, where we did more journalism than we ever had in our lives. As you may know, in February of 2022, we had 400 million views and impressions. So certainly a lot of people around the world thought we were doing journalism. How can you, we were broadcasting almost 24 hours a day during the trucker convoy. How can you watch that 3 weeks of journalism and say, no, that's not journalism? We didn't figure it out until the very end of the hearing today. The government said, no, none of that was journalism. None of that counts, because at the end of some of those videos or on the website, we mentioned a crowdfunding campaign for the truckers. So the government said, yes, you did an enormous amount of journalism. They mentioned podcasts, documentaries, etc. But they said, because you supported the truckers and invited other people to support it, we're not calling that news. None of our coverage on the truckers counted because it was all, and at the end we'd say, hey, if you want to support us, go to, truckerlawyer.com or whatever our website was. That's why we're banned for our support of the truckers. They literally admitted that in court today, their lawyers. I thought that was incredible. I was getting bogged down in the minutia, the different rules, and I mean, here's an example. The law says a QCJO journalism organization merely has to have 2 unrelated people publishing news on current events. Well, we have 30 people doing that. Obviously, we meet the test. Frankly, even if only, quote, 2% of our stuff is real news, that's still much more news than is necessary to qualify. So it was really going down the rabbit hole, and I just sort of thought, what are we doing here? You have 4, 5, 6, 7 lawyers, 3 judges at the Federal Court of Appeal. You have 2 clerks. I don't know how much money the government has spent on this over the last 5 years, $1 million fighting us. And I thought, I agree with some of the things the lawyers are saying. I disagree with other things. But why are we in a court? Why was a government panel telling government bureaucrats that we should be denied our journalism status? And why was a government lawyer arguing to a government judge that what is the government doing involved with who is a journalist at all? Since when did politicians, judges, lawyers, bureaucrats have the ability to determine who a journalist is? Like, who the hell are they to sit in judgment of me? Now, I happen to think that we meet all the tests. I happen to think it's clear they rigged the rules to be against us. It's clear that they handpicked a committee that hated Rebel News. This whole thing is really a way just to get Rebel News. I've heard 2 other journalists refer to the QCJO system as the Get Rebel rule. I believe that we passed the test. If the CBC and if the Toronto Star does, we sure do too. But why should I even have to jump over their hurdles? Since when does a journalist in any self-respecting democracy have to please the politicians before having the right to cover the politicians? Politicians don't have a veto who gets to cover them. That's reverse. Journalists scrutinize politicians. Politicians don't get to scrutinize. Well, they can scrutinize, but to ban, to punish or reward journalists, it was pretty gross in there. The judges did ask some good questions of the government side, which gives me a flicker of hope. But really, I think what our biggest hurdle today was the standard of review. And let me give you 1 minute about what that means to lawyers. So the Canada Revenue Agency made this decision, and as I mentioned, they were pressured by Trudeau's friends. So we appealed that to the federal court, and then we are appealing that to the Federal Court of Appeal. And the question that Federal Court of Appeal judges have to ask themselves is, how much deference do we give to the CRA which blacklisted Rebel News? How much do we have to respect their expertise? And it's different in different cases, but the law, I think, in this case is reasonableness, not correctness. Here's what I mean. The Federal Court of Appeal there wasn't a do-over, there wasn't evidence, it wasn't a new hearing. They were just looking at the case and saying, was the ruling to blacklist Rebel News reasonable, plausible, understandable, even if it was wrong? That's the standard of reasonableness, which is a lower standard than correctness. Did they get it right? Even Mark Carney's lawyers today were saying, Judge, if this is wrong, if this is an incorrect decision, you still have to support it because we defer to the lower decision makers. So even Mark Carney's lawyers themselves were saying, we're not even going to try and argue that this was correct. We just have to say that, could someone believe this? And again, what am I doing in court? I don't know, we've probably spent $100,000 on this case over the last 5 years. I know the government's probably spent $1 million. Why are we in court arguing about whether or not we have the right to be journalists? Or why do we have to prove that it was unreasonable or incorrect or whatever for us to be journalists? I find it very frustrating and a little bit sad. I'm not sure how we're going to do here. If we lose again, I am going to seek leave to appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, because I want the Supreme Court of Canada to either own this or disown this. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. We haven't had the ruling here yet. There were some positive moments where the government lawyers were grilled a bit, but it's very hard. You don't get a lot of wins at the Federal Court of Appeal. They tend to stand by the lower court cases. I'm going to think about this some more, but the one thing that gave me a little bit of hope when I was in the courtroom by myself with all these other expensive people making decisions about our freedom. Oh, by the way, the government said the Charter of Rights does not apply here. How do you feel about that? But the one thing that gave me a little flicker of hope was this. A few years ago, Elon Musk bought Twitter. And so Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney, when they decide who is or isn't a journalist, that does have some real world impact on us. I mentioned how it affects the taxes of our subscribers. I mentioned how it could affect us being throttled online. But that was all done before Elon Musk freed Twitter. He renamed it X. And in a lot of places, what happens here is really important. It's important to us. It could put us in legal jeopardy. But I think Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney and the other bullies of the world, I think in some ways they've been gone around, gone through, gone under, as in, I don't think a lot of people are listening to them anymore. People are choosing to get information on their own, regardless of what this court says, regardless of what the CRA says, regardless of what Mark Carney or Justin Trudeau says. And so I very much want to win this court case, and if I lose it, I'm going to appeal to the Supreme Court. But I think that we have in part been saved by Elon Musk and his dedication to free speech that in some ways is bigger than what any bureaucrat, politician, lawyer, or judge has to say. And I'm holding on to that. I'm holding on to that because I need to have a little bit of hope. All right, I'm going to make my way back to our office. Strange day at the Federal Court of Appeal. We're in there alone fighting for freedom of the press. It's sort of depressing. But if you can help us out, I'd be grateful for it. I haven't got my legal bill for today. There's no chance that today's hearing will be less than $25,000. Just no chance. If you can help, please go to letusreport.com. And by the way, you can read the legal briefs for yourself there. We put both Mark Carney's legal brief and ours, so you can read it over and see if I'm right. There you have it. For Rebel News, I'm Ezra Levant. And to help us out, which I need, go to letusreport.com. Thanks.